In a back room of a Belfast safe house, sometime in the late 1980s, a thick-set man in his middle 40s sat across a table from another man, younger, terrified, hands cable-tied behind a chair. The thick-set man was Freddie Scappaticci. He was the officer commanding of the Provisional IRA's Internal Security Unit, the section of the organisation responsible for identifying, interrogating and executing volunteers suspected of being British informers. The younger man across the table was a British informer. The interrogation that night ended the way most of Scappaticci's interrogations ended. The younger man did not leave the safe house alive. What the younger man did not know, what nobody on the IRA side of the room knew, was that the man interrogating him was also a British informer, the most senior the British state had ever recruited inside the Provisional IRA, and that the British Army officers in a country house in Ashford, Kent, had been paying him for 15 years. The country house in Ashford, Kent, is the part of this story that gets the least attention. Most of what has been written about Scappaticci and about Brian Nelson and about the dirty war on either side of the Irish border has been written about the men on the ground in Belfast and Derry and South Armagh. The handlers have stayed in the margins. The unit they belong to has stayed in the margins. The country house in Kent has stayed in the margins. And the public record of what the unit did and how it did it has, until very recently, stayed in the margins too. This is a story about that unit, the Force Research Unit, the British Army's agent handling apparatus in Northern Ireland from 1980 to 2007. The handlers who paid Scappaticci, the handlers who paid Nelson. The handlers who, in the words of a sitting Prime Minister speaking from the dispatch box in December 2012, produced what David Cameron called shocking levels of collusion with the loyalist murder gangs of the 1980s. The story begins on the British Army's side in 1980. The Force Research Unit was set up that year, initially as a small agent handling cell working alongside brigade research units already operating in the province. It was given its formal designation, Force Research Unit, in 1982, and that 1982 date comes from the Pat Finucane Review, the December 2012 report by Sir Desmond de Silva QC, which examined the unit's institutional history in some detail. Before 1982, agent running had been handled by the Army Research Organisation and by the brigade research units assigned to each operational area. After 1982, it was centralised under the Intelligence Corps, centralised under a single commanding officer, and centralised, the FRU's own internal motto would later record, around the discipline of what the unit called fishers of men. That phrase, fishers of men, was not invented for public consumption. It was, the Canova report would conclude 4 decades later, the unit's self-styled description of its own purpose. By the mid-1980s, the FRU had its headquarters at British Army HQ Northern Ireland in Lisburn, and 4 operational detachments scattered across the province. East Detachment ran agents in Greater Belfast from Palace Barracks at Holywood. North Detachment ran agents in Derry from Ebrington Barracks. South Detachment, the busiest of the 4, operated out of Bessbrook Mill in the bandit country of South Armagh. There was a 4th, smaller detachment based at RAF St Angelo near Enniskillen. According to the De Silva Review, by the late 1980s, the FRU was running 42 handlers and 26 support staff. The Stevens inquiry would interview 20 of those former members. But the unit's centre of gravity, the place where the FRU's handlers were selected and trained and taught the doctrine they would apply on the ground, was not in Northern Ireland at all. It was in Kent. Repton Manor sits in what used to be the grounds of Templar Barracks, on the outskirts of Ashford. Templar Barracks was the headquarters and depot of the British Army's Intelligence Corps from 1966 until 1997, when the Corps moved to Chicksands and the land was sold off for the Channel Tunnel terminal redevelopment. Most of the barracks has since been demolished. Repton Manor, a Grade II listed building, still stands, now the centrepiece of a residential estate called Repton Park. In the FRU years, Repton Manor was simply called the Manor by the soldiers who worked there. It was run by something called the Specialised Intelligence Wing, the SIW, which itself sat within the School of Service Intelligence. The senior instructor was always an Intelligence Corps officer. The directing staff were drawn from across the Army, including from the Special Forces community. The barn and stables behind the manor were used to keep the surveillance-adapted cars and vans that the handlers and the operators of 14 Intelligence Company drove in Belfast and Newry and Strabane. Years later, after the unit had been renamed and the barracks had been demolished and most of the men who taught at the manor had retired, a member of the public would post a comment on a YouTube video about 14 Intelligence Company. The commenter said he had known the place. He said the FRU had been based in his day at Repton Manor, Templar Barracks, Ashford. He gave the location twice on 2 different videos 6 weeks apart. He had 11 likes on his comment. Nothing about it was wrong. What was taught at Repton Manor was the agent handling doctrine. The doctrine had a particular character. It was handler-led, meaning the FRU handler, not the agent, controlled the tasking. It was multiple source, meaning the handlers were trained to cross-check the intelligence one agent produced against the intelligence other agents produced, and never to act on a single source. It was compartmented, meaning each handler knew their agents but did not know the agents of the handlers in the next room. And it was, at its centre, organised around a principle that would later become both the unit's greatest claim to operational achievement and its greatest moral and legal flashpoint. The principle was the protection of source. The principle held that an agent who had been successfully embedded inside a paramilitary organisation was a strategic asset worth protecting at significant cost. The cost, in some cases, was that the agent would witness or contribute to criminal acts that the handlers had a duty to prevent. Handlers met their agents in places the IRA and the UDA did not watch. Hotel car parks on the outskirts of Lisburn and Hillsborough, forestry car parks in the Mournes, service stations on the A1 between Belfast and Newry. The meetings were short. The handler asked the questions, the agent supplied the answers, and the handler returned to the detachment with the product. The product was written up, indexed, cross-referenced against other agents, and circulated within the FRU's collection cell. The agent was paid in cash. The agent was also looked after, given travel, lodging in safe houses outside the country when the heat rose, occasional holidays in Spain or in England to keep the IRA's own investigators from catching up. Operation Canova would later report that Stakeknife was taken on holiday by his handlers to put distance between him and police questioning at moments of particular pressure. The principle of source protection, applied at scale, produced a doctrine in which an agent's continued operation became, in some cases, the institutional priority over the lives of the people the agent was watching. What the official record did not show in the 1980s was how often that principle was being tested, and how often it was failing. By every account from those who were there, the FRU's agent inventory in the late 1980s included 2 men who would become the 2 most consequential informers the British state had ever recruited inside the paramilitaries of Northern Ireland. One worked for the UDA. The other worked for the Provisional IRA. The UDA man was Brian Nelson. He was born on the Shankill Road in Belfast on the 30th of September 1947. He had served briefly with the Black Watch as a young man before being discharged. He had drifted into the UDA in the early 1970s, in the period when the organisation was still legal under British law. By the early 1980s, he was a low-level intelligence agent for the Royal Ulster Constabulary, then briefly out of the country in West Germany. In 1985, the government approached him on the basis of his previous military service, asked him to re-enlist with the UDA as a covert government agent, and offered him a salary of £200 a week. He was given the codename 6137. He was run by the East Detachment of the Force Research Unit, the detachment that covered Greater Belfast. He rose over the next 4 years to become the intelligence chief of the UDA. He was, by the time the Stevens inquiry team came looking for him in January 1990, the most powerful loyalist intelligence officer in the city. He was also the British Army's paid informant. What Nelson did over those 4 years was produce what his FRU handlers called intelligence packages. The packages were dossiers, background, address, photograph, daily movements, on people the UDA had identified as targets. According to the De Silva Review, the information that went into the packages was drawn in significant part from sources that should have been confidential to Nelson's handlers. According to the Stevens inquiry, the packages were then circulated within the UDA's targeting committees. According to the Brian Nelson prison diary, portions of which were quoted on BBC Panorama in June 1992 in a programme called The Dirty War, the production of the packages and the passing of them was understood by Nelson to have been done with the knowledge of his handlers. Then a man named Lachlan McGinn died, and everything began to change. Lachlan McGinn was a 28-year-old Catholic with no paramilitary connections. He lived at Lisses, near Rathfreeland in County Down. On the 25th of August 1989, the UDA shot him at his front door. The UDA then claimed he had been a Provisional IRA intelligence officer. He was not. He had no paramilitary connections. To support its claim, the UDA released photographs of British Army intelligence documents that had clearly been originated by a security force agency and that named McGinn as a Republican target. The release of those photographs was the moment the public realised, for the first time, that someone inside the British security forces had been passing UDA targeting material. The Royal Ulster Constabulary Chief Constable, Sir Hugh Annesley, asked Sir John Stevens, then the Deputy Chief Constable of Cambridgeshire, to investigate. The first Stevens inquiry began the following month, in September 1989. What the first Stevens inquiry uncovered over the 4 months that followed was Brian Nelson. The team identified him, traced his handlers, and on the night of the 9th of January 1990 prepared to arrest him at his home in Belfast the following morning. That night, some time after the team had left their incident room at the Royal Ulster Constabulary's Sea Park complex in Carrickfergus, the room was set on fire. The smoke alarms did not go off, the heat sensors did not trigger, the telephone lines had been cut. The fire protection system had no water in it. 4 members of the team, who had unexpectedly come back to the room 25 minutes after leaving, found the room alight and called the fire brigade. Stevens publicly stated, then and afterwards, that he believed the fire to be a deliberate act of arson. His team was convinced the arsonists were members of the Force Research Unit, working with assistance from inside Special Branch to access the secure complex. The arrest of Brian Nelson the next day was aborted. Nelson had been warned by his handlers to leave his home overnight. He was eventually arrested at a hotel in England in the days that followed. The truth is, by the time Stevens published the overview of his third inquiry in April 2003, the FRU's institutional protection of its asset had been very nearly exhaustively documented. Stevens concluded there had been collusion in the murders of Patrick Finucane and Brian Adam Lambert. He concluded the collusion ranged from the willful failure to keep records, the absence of accountability, the withholding of intelligence and evidence, through to the extreme of agents being involved in murder. He found that Brian Nelson had been aware and contributed materially to the intended attack on Finucane. He found that the murders could have been prevented. 21 of his recommendations were published. The full reports, 3 of them running across more than a decade of investigation, remain partially classified. What Brian Nelson's role had been in the murder of Patrick Finucane was, by then, the most studied question of the Dirty War. Patrick Finucane was 39 years old. He was a Belfast solicitor. On the evening of the 12th of February 1989, a Sunday, masked UDA gunmen kicked in the door of his home in North Belfast. They shot him 14 times in front of his wife Geraldine, who was wounded, and in front of his 3 children. Brian Nelson had, by his own admission in his prison diary, been asked to gather information on Finucane in the weeks before the killing. He had, by his own admission, passed a photograph of Finucane to a UDA member named Eric McKee days before the killing. He had, by the conclusion of every subsequent inquiry, contributed materially to a murder in which the British state was meaningfully implicated. In December 2012, 23 years after the killing, 10 years after Stevens, Sir Desmond de Silva QC produced the Patrick Finucane Review, and David Cameron stood up in the House of Commons and acknowledged shocking levels of collusion. The Finucane family rejected the de Silva Review as a paper exercise. They were not allowed to give evidence to it. The campaign they had been running since 1989 for a full public inquiry continued. In September 2024, 35 years after the killing, the Northern Ireland Secretary Hilary Benn announced that a statutory public inquiry, the inquiry the Finucane family had been demanding for 35 years, would finally be held. Brian Nelson himself never lived to see it. He was tried at Belfast Crown Court on the 22nd of January 1992 in front of Lord Justice Basil Kelly. He pleaded guilty to 20 charges, 5 of conspiracy to murder, 1 of illegally possessing a firearm, and 14 of possessing information likely to be useful to terrorists. The 2 murder charges he had originally been charged with were dropped as part of the plea arrangement. Lord Justice Kelly sentenced him to 10 years, concurrent. A week later, on the 29th of January, the head of the Force Research Unit at the time of Nelson's running, a colonel known to the court only as Colonel J, gave evidence in mitigation. Colonel J's real name was Gordon Kerr. He had commanded the FRU from 1987 to 1991. He had since been promoted. He told the court that Nelson's intelligence had saved approximately 217 lives, and that the casualties Nelson's targeting had directly produced numbered only 3. The Stevens inquiry, when it came to examine that claim, found evidence that only 2 lives had been saved. The de Silva Review found 3. The Corey collusion inquiry concluded, in its own quiet language, that Colonel J's testimony was, at the very least, misleading. Brian Nelson served part of his sentence. He was released in 1998 under the early release provisions of the Good Friday Agreement. He died on the 11th of April 2003, 6 days before Sir John Stevens published the overview of his third inquiry, of a brain hemorrhage in England, aged 55. The other man, the more senior man, the man who had been sitting at the table in the back room of the Belfast safe house, was Stakeknife. Stakeknife was an internal British Army code name. The man behind the codename was Freddie Scappaticci. He was born in the Markets area of Belfast on the 12th of January 1946. His father, Daniel, had emigrated to Belfast from Italy in the 1920s. By 1980, according to the Operation Canova interim report published in March 2024, Scappaticci was a senior figure in the Provisional IRA's Internal Security Unit, the section of the organisation that the IRA called the Nutting Squad, because the way it executed informers was to put a bullet through the back of the head. He worked, by his own admission to his wife and to a female associate, as a paid agent of the British state. He worked, by the conclusion of the Operation Canova interim report, as the most senior penetration agent the British state had ever achieved inside the Provisional IRA. What Scappaticci's day-to-day role within the IRA meant, in practice, was that he was the man the IRA tasked with interrogating other IRA volunteers who had been accused of being British informers. The interrogations took place in safe houses on both sides of the Irish border. The accused men were stripped, beaten, told they would be hanged upside down in a cattle shed in South Armagh, and skinned alive. Some confessed, some did not. Most were shot through the back of the head and their bodies left, in the early hours of the morning, on country roads near the border. Operation Canova, which was set up in 2016 under former Bedfordshire Chief Constable John Butcher and continued under Sir Ian Livingstone, examined the activities of Stakeknife in some detail. The interim report, published on the 8th of March 2024, named more than 24 offences in which Canova had treated him as a suspect, including conspiracy to murder, conspiracy to unlawfully imprison, conspiracy to kidnap, false imprisonment, unlawful wounding, grievous bodily harm, and unlawful possession of firearms. The final report, published on the 9th of December 2025, set the figure at 14 murders and 15 abductions investigated. The Operation Canova interim report's most quoted finding, however, was the moral one. The British state's defence of the Stakeknife operation, as it had been defended in the press for 2 decades, had been that the agents saved hundreds of lives, perhaps even thousands. The Canova interim report rejected the claim explicitly. The lives saved by Stakeknife's intelligence, the report concluded, ran between high single figures and low double figures. The lives that his continued operation as an agent had cost ran much higher. The report's conclusion, in its single most quoted sentence, was that it is likely that his crimes as an agent resulted in more lives being lost than were saved. Freddie Scappaticci died on the 20th of March 2023 in England, aged 77. He had changed his name to Frank Cowley by deed poll in January 2020. He had spent his last 20 years living under a new identity at British public expense. After the Sunday Tribune, the Sunday Herald, the Sunday World, and the Irish edition of the People all named him as Stakeknife in May 2003. He had brought legal proceedings seeking to require the British government to publicly state that he was not Stakeknife. Those proceedings did not produce the statement he sought. He had never been charged with a Troubles-related offence. In February 2026, the Taoiseach of Ireland, Micheál Martin, named him on the floor of the Dáil as Stakeknife. The British government did not respond. By every account from those who knew it, the relationship between the Force Research Unit and the other army units operating in plain clothes in Northern Ireland was clearly bounded but easily blurred. The Force Research Unit ran the agents. 14 intelligence company, the Det, watched the targets the agents named. The unit Stevens documented in the third inquiry as having burned his evidence in Carrickfergus was the FRU, not the detective. The unit the inquiries returned to again and again 21 years apart, was the FRU. The Debts surveillance operators, the men whose stories James Rennie told in his 1996 book The Operators, and whose officer, Captain Robert Nairac, had been killed in May 1977 in the South Armagh Badlands, were watchers. They were not handlers. The handlers were in Lisburn, and in the 4 detachments, and in Repton Manor in Ashford. 3 army-sponsored undercover intelligence squads operated in Northern Ireland through the 1980s and 1990s. 22 SAS, 14 Intelligence Company, and the Force Research Unit. They worked closely, traded intelligence, and shared the secrecy that protected each. The boundary between them, by the testimony of the men who worked under it, was supposed to be clear. The Stevens record suggests, in places, that it was not. In 2007, the Force Research Unit was renamed. It became the Joint Support Group, the JSG. The renaming coincided with the end of Operation Banner, the long British Army mission in Northern Ireland that had begun in August 1969. It coincided with the publication of Sir John Stevens's recommendations. It coincided with the formal closure of the Northern Ireland chapter of the unit's history. The JSG continues to exist. It continues to recruit and run agents. It continues to be commanded out of the Intelligence Corps chain. It does not operate any longer, by any account in the public record, inside the United Kingdom. The Public Prosecution Service for Northern Ireland received 28 files from Operation Canova. The PPS, having considered each file in turn, decided that none of them met the test for prosecution. 5 retired soldiers who had served with the Force Research Unit appeared in those files, 3 of them handlers, 2 of them more senior, holding the positions of operations officer and commanding officer. None of them were prosecuted. None of them have been named in the public record. They retain the anonymity the PPSNI granted them, and the script of this video will not break that anonymity, because the public record does not. The country house in Ashford, Kent is still there. The Force Research Unit is now called the Joint Support Group and operates in places that this script will not name. Brian Nelson died in 2003. Freddie Scappaticci died in 2023. The men they helped to kill are buried in cemeteries on both sides of the Irish border. The handlers who paid them are, in many cases, the men the legacy law architecture this channel covered in its previous video is now examining. The audience that asked for this video in a 43-like comment under our 14 Intelligence Company piece is one of those men. We have made this video for him. We have also made it for the families of the people his work touched on every side. They are owed at least the record.